Welcome to 5 Questions with Stephen Brown, Director of Innovation at Polarisoft. I'm Madeline Lipthrott, and I lead membership services with TAG. Stephen, I'm thrilled to spend a few minutes with you today. For over 20 years, you've been addressing the needs of businesses to consume and manage more and more information. Please tell us about your experience and your work with Polarisoft.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Really pleasure to be here. I've spent a lot of my career just engaging with businesses around what we refer to as enterprise mess. So if you have a big, complicated organization that has loads and loads of complexity to it, we create technology to make that an easier journey from all the way from planning and strategy down to really making that execution of that strategy and the delivery of it happen on the ground.
Well, we'll just dive right into these questions. So to kick us off, you've spent most of your career in business management software. Where do you think the industry is today?
I have the great pleasure of starting my career really at the dawn of the internet. So there's a moment in my career at the very beginning when I remember the very first web browser came out, and Java was released and HTML was created. So I was right there at the beginning. And if you really look at that mission in the industry over the last 30 years, it's really been this one specific thing we've been trying to do is put people in contact with data. And if you really look at that from a track record of what we've done in connecting systems and people with information, we've not only been able to do that at the access to data level, meaning individuals being able to get to data, but also in the content creation side of the fence. I mean, how many of us create content every day now compared to digital content 30 years ago wasn't there? And if you really look at that at a little shorter lens, you'll see that in the last 10 years, we've really started to see that shift from not only connectivity and access to data, but really trying to make that data useful. I mean, now we have all of the data, both across our industry and in my personal day-to-day. I really don't look at data anymore as the problem. You can, of course, source data from individuals, from technology, from your operating machinery, all of those things that are going on in the business, you can get the information. But is it useful? I mean, right now you're seeing a shift in the industry, really looking at the human behavior and the psychology of how we consume information. And that's been a really exciting change. And this is really reflected in the language you see over the last 10 years. The words like data science becoming a very well understood and known thing. I mean, data science has been around since the beginning of technology. It's been around for 50 years. But how we think about data and how we interact with it has really changed in the last 10 years because we realize that gleaning decision-making information out of data that's out there in the world is really beyond just data. It's actually about how human beings interact with that data. And decision-making requires a lot more than data. It's human experience combined with that information that allows us to make a decision. This also goes well beyond the industry. When you look at us as a society, you really see this thing I see with my kids right now. When you look at how education worked when I was growing up, it was based on the Victorian concept of remember a lot of things because you don't have access to a library all of the time. However, today you can Google every fact. So access to information is no longer what's important, but what we do with it. And we're seeing that both in business and in our personal lives. That real shift in the industry to today is about what do we do with information, not can we get to it.
And so there's a lot of talk today about using AI in decision making. Do you think that will become a reality soon?
That is a great question. I remember in like early 2000s when I came out of university in the late 90s, and I remember at the beginning that everyone was talking about artificial intelligence, like computing was going to be taken over any moment. And then it fell flat on its face. It was really amazing. I mean, it was such a buzzword, hip thing at the time, and for 15 years it disappeared. But in the last 5 years, you've really seen that language around AI come back, and a lot of organizations starting to look at how that can help them in their business world in a way that wasn't really possible 20 years ago. but is possible today. And there's some really fundamental reasons for that. One is AI itself has gotten so much better. We really understand it better. We understand machine learning better. And it has some really great examples of uses that you can do today, which you couldn't have done 20 years ago. And part of that's just access to data in a way we didn't have it. The Internet of Things has made stuff possible. Some applications for AI that would never have been there 20 years ago that today look really easy. I mean, great examples of AI applicable outcomes are really when you start to look at things where an evolving data set helps inform the outcome. So if you look at it from a good example might be a parking garage. You have a parking garage with 5 entry points, and you want to route the traffic coming into the parking garage to the entry point that is the least congested. Well, the more information you have about what's inside the parking garage, the easier it is for AI to determine what's going to impact the flow of traffic. That's great on those kinds of decisions where more information helps us really create a set of intelligence that can drive an outcome. However, with all of that said and all the great things that it can do, we've also seen AI fall a little bit short on the complex decision making. So we have this product called PPM Anywhere, which is there to help businesses execute their strategy, build up portfolios of things that they plan in their business and project investments they're going to do, services, all that kinds of stuff, and build that into a portfolio. An R&D group spends a lot of time trying to figure out how do we make the best decisions out of that. When we look at how AI fits into that model, what we find is AI doesn't, and I think this is for the whole industry, is going this way. AI is not there to make the complex decision making that requires human intuition. Where AI is going to help us is where you end up in scenarios where a human being is making a decision in which might be counterintuitive based on the data and the history that goes with that decision. So there's a good example. One of the psychological precepts we use in design is something called compensatory conviction. Have you ever heard this term?
I am not familiar.
Okay. So compensatory conviction is when if you have a decision to be made and you have just heard bad news, you tend to be more conservative about the decision you're going to make. So for instance, if you have just lost a bunch of money on an investment, a separate unrelated investment you probably aren't going to take as much risk with because you have just felt the pain of the loss of the previous investment. Okay. This plays out in business. You might have walked out of a project meeting where you had a project that was just going all kinds of wrong and is totally on fire and it's going to be a big political nightmare at work. So it's a terrible meeting. And you go right from that meeting into a meeting about a project that's doing okay, but requires additional funding. The compensatory conviction tells us that you'll be conservative about the release of that money, even though these two projects may be completely unrelated. And this is where AI can help us. I mean, AI can do things like tell us, well, actually, you're not making a decision based off of the data. You're making a decision based off of experience, some of which may not be relevant. Does that all make sense?
It does. It's super interesting. And so to kind of pivot, what do you feel are the key technologies for a business to implement?
Yeah, that's always a tough one. The one thing I would say is today is a very fascinating time for us to be in business in the industry. For the access to technology at all levels is so good today compared with where it was, 30, 40, 50 years ago, even 10 years ago, to be honest. And there's probably maybe 3 areas that I would encourage everyone, regardless if they're a tiny little business, 2 men and a dog, or if they're a massive global corporation with 100,000 people. There's really probably 3 areas that are really easy to achieve great outcomes in, and everyone should be investing in. First for me is always strategy enablement. I mean, part of this is the industry I've gone into, but when you really look at this from afar, the challenges that people have today are really pretty strategic. You're trying to take a business strategy and play it out over a longish period of time. 18 months is usually what we tell people is the shortest amount of time you need to determine if a strategy is working. However, quite often staff retention is so short in organizations that people don't remember what strategies have been tried in the past, what was successful, what wasn't successful, what were the challenges they came up to. So every 3 years, you see the same stuff come around again and again and again. And a lot of that is they don't have a place or a facility to really understand what's happened in the past, what's worked, and are they being effective. So the number one investment I would tell people to make in technology is something that can track your plan versus your reality over long periods of time. A portfolio planning system, ERP system. There's loads of different language for what that is, but anything that can help you build up a strategy, an execution plan, and track the outcomes over time so that you have that history always available at your fingertips, you should definitely do that. And the market's changed a lot over years. So these things are pretty easy to obtain. Second for me, and this is something I love. I love this about the technology industry. Engaging with your customer has never been easier and better, and it's never been easier to get to know your customer better. For me, this is knowing how do they use your product? Why did they buy the product? What is the value proposition they were going for? What is the value proposition they're getting, right? Usually those things are not 100% aligned. Why do they care about using your product? Why do they buy from you versus your competitor? Really being able to not only listen with your ears and being able to talk to your customer, but using all of those data points around how they interact with you from your website, from the emails, from product usage, from sales orders. All of that data is there for you to know your customer at a level that's never really been possible, and not just treat them like a number, but use that to understand how do they want to be engaged with. And that to me is really huge, and a place where everyone should be investing money is into some sort of customer relationship management system, solution, whatever phrase you like best for that. And lastly would be automate everything. If you can automate it, automate it. This is absolutely one of my passions. We help people automate stuff, so clearly I love it. But when you walk into an organization and they tell you, I wish we had more budget for this, or we had better funding to go do this, the answer to that question is automate. If you automate things that are costing you lots of time and people money, very, very quickly will you end up shifting your available investment into a strategic pot that allows you to go do the next thing. But if you avoid doing that automation, you end up spending loads and loads of your capital just on maintaining rather than actually investing and moving forward. That was probably the longest answer to the shortest question ever.
There's such good things for businesses to think about, though. And I love your emphasis on historical outcomes and the fact that there is so much data out there and being more personable with your customers. Super important. And so, what mistakes do you see organizations make when they're implementing technology?
How long do we have? No, in all seriousness, yeah, there's so many mistakes that are easy to make, especially in technology. And the problem with technology is technology mistakes can be really expensive. But if I really boil it down, there's probably two primary mistakes people make. The first is assuming that technology is a silver bullet. You have some big business problem. It doesn't really matter what it is, but you have some big business problems. So you go out to the technology market and you buy a piece of technology to solve that problem. You put it in place and it doesn't instantaneously solve your problem. So you lose focus. You don't give it enough time to actually work on the solution and all of the things that happened. This silver bullet approach, the analogy I tell people all the time is it's like exercise. I've decided I want to become healthier and more fit. I'd like more exercise in my life. So I go out and I buy a Peloton bike. So as soon as that comes, I unwrap it and I'm healthier and more fit. No, that doesn't work that way. Yes, I have the equipment, but at the end of the day, it's going to take me getting up every day and using the bike and doing it until my psychology changes, where it's embedded in my brain that this is what has to happen every single day. Just like a business change, you can buy technology, but if you don't actually take it all the way through that time frame to embed it into your business and for it to become part of the ethos of how you operate, you're never going to make that change stick. And the second thing is the pendulum swing for organizations. They go out and they buy a piece of technology, and it really hits pretty quickly 90% of the value proposition they were trying to get to, right? Because the first 90% is usually pretty easy. It's closing that last 10% is really hard. And what they end up doing is, rather than trying to do an incremental solution of just make it slightly better and slightly better and slightly better until you get to that 100%, knowing that that's hard to do and is going to take a lot of time. Instead of doing that, they go, okay, this isn't working. Let's rip this technology out. Let's put in new technology, swing the pendulum all the way the other side, and end up having a totally different 90% that they've solved, but they still end up with the same 10. They still end up with a 10% gap. Maybe it's a different 10%, but they still end up with the same 10% gap. Went through a very expensive exercise and weren't able to actually get to where they're going. And we see this a lot. And that issue is actually really about understanding the technology business alignment rather than it is about implementing technology.
All right. And so my final question, what does the future hold for business management technology?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I definitely think it's an exciting time for the industry. And I love technology. I mean, to watch technology play out over the last 25 years has been amazing. We have so much access to data and automation, and it's easy to get today. I mean, I remember when I first started my career, these things weren't easy to get. They were super expensive, but it's pretty easy to get. And I really think the interesting thing in our marketplace is when you look at who implements technology, especially sophisticated technology, I think you're going to see more of the small, medium enterprise, or what we refer to as the SME market, have access to sophisticated tools in a way that was only available to the corporates in the past because of the cost, but the cost has come down. And in a lot of ways, the SME market, I think, is going to be much better earlier adopters as we move forward. When you look at how big corporates procure technology, they actually have quite a slow, steady kind of bureaucratic way of doing that. And they rely heavily on the analysts. And what you find out of all of that environment is, by the time they get to the point where there is a piece of technology that are all trusting, quite often it's already in the legacy land for what's actually happening in the industry. And I think what we're going to see moving forward is some of those big corporates realizing that they need to be early adopters, because the SME market is actually getting the technology quicker, earlier. They're using it better. They're more nimble in that competitive advantage that used to only exist for the big corporates because they could have this at scale. Isn't going to be a competitive advantage anymore. It's going to be really right down there in the SME market as well. I think we're going to see a lot of the smaller guys really nipping at the heels of the bigger guys because of it. And it'll create that strategic advantage for those early adopters. And I think in the long term, probably slightly different set of issues, but I think it's going to go after what we refer to as the key 2%. So quite often organizations think they need to make some big, massive change to make progress. So meaning we got to do a 30% reduction in cost or a 30% increase in sales. And all of that's great, and those big movements are awesome when they happen. But the reality is, you don't need to be focusing on that on a day-to-day basis. Focusing on 2% or some small incremental improvement is plenty. And I think we're going to see the technology move us towards that, because if you start to look at a model where you say, I've increased my customer count by 2%, I've increased my price by 2%, I've decreased my cost by 2%, all of a sudden you end up with a big swing in those kinds of models. And I think most of the technology that we're going to see come out in the future will be less about gathering data, less about automation, and more about how do you use all of that flow of information and the automation of that data going through your organization to gain that 2% optimization to just give you that edge over your competitor.
Awesome. So much to take in here. Your work is super interesting, Stephen, and I truly appreciate you spending a few minutes with me to share a little bit about what's going on in your world. Also, thank you for your partnership with TAG and your passion for technology and your leadership in the technology community. So happy to have you as a TAG member, and so happy that we're able to share some of your insights. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.